The first time I saw Eliza, she was leaning against a weathered stone pillar at the edge of the bustling market square. Her auburn hair glowed like embers under the afternoon sun, and her laughter floated above the noise like a melody. I didn't need another reason to be captivated. I was already hers, and she was mine. The world could keep its disapproving whispers and furrowed brows. None of it mattered as long as we had each other. We had been together for 2 years, but those years felt like lifetimes compressed into moments. Every glance, every touch carried the intensity of two people who knew they might not have the luxury of forever. My name is Adam, and hers, Eliza. She wasn't just my love. She was my rebellion against a life of expectations, an anchor in a world I didn't always understand. But life wasn't as simple as our stolen kisses and quiet walks through the meadows outside our small town. My mother, an ever-practical woman with sharp eyes and an even sharper tongue, had never approved of Eliza. "She's too wild, Adam," she would say, her lips pressing into a thin line. No roots, no stability, just trouble. Eliza's father, a man of towering stature and an intimidating presence, had his own objections. He saw me as a failure waiting to happen, a young man with too many dreams and not enough reality to ground them. "You think love is enough?" he once sneered at me during one of our rare, hostile encounters. "Wait until the world chews you up and spits you out. Then we'll see how much you still care for my daughter." Eliza and I ignored them, brushing off their disapproval like stray leaves caught in the wind. We'd often escape to the hills just beyond the town's borders, where the horizon seemed to stretch on forever, promising a life that wasn't bound by judgment or tradition. "I can't do this anymore, Adam," Eliza said one evening as we lay on a blanket beneath a sky littered with stars. Her voice was soft, but there was an edge to it that made my chest tighten. "What do you mean?" I asked, turning to face her. The moonlight caught her profile, highlighting the curve of her cheek and the slight tremble of her lips. "This town, my father, your mother, all of it," she sighed, her breath visible in the cool night air. "I want to leave, just you and me, start over somewhere else, somewhere they can't touch us." I hesitated, the weight of her words settling over me. I had always dreamed of leaving, of carving out a life that was ours and ours alone. But the reality of it, the sheer finality, was terrifying. "Do you mean that?" I asked, searching her eyes for a hint of doubt. "Yes," she said firmly, reaching for my hand. "I love you, Adam, and I'm tired of pretending that love has to come second to everything else." Her words ignited something in me, a fire that burned away my hesitation and replaced it with determination. "Then let's do it," I said, squeezing her hand. "Let's leave. Tonight." The decision was made in a heartbeat, but the execution was less graceful. We packed in silence, our movements hurried and clumsy as we tried to gather everything we thought we'd need. Eliza grabbed an old leather suitcase that had seen better days, stuffing it with clothes and trinkets that seemed important in the moment. I took my father's worn rucksack, filling it with essentials, food, water, and the little money I had managed to save. By midnight, we were on the road, the town fading into the distance behind us. The air was crisp, and the stars above seemed brighter, as if they were cheering us on. We didn't have a plan, only a shared desire to be free. It wasn't until the sun began to rise that we stopped to rest, finding shelter in an abandoned barn at the edge of a sprawling field. Exhaustion weighed heavily on us, but there was also a strange exhilaration in knowing that we were finally free. "I can't believe we actually did it," Eliza said, her voice tinged with disbelief as she sat cross-legged on the dusty floor. "Me neither," I admitted, leaning against a wooden beam. "But I'm glad we did." She smiled at me, her eyes shining with a mix of excitement and relief. "This is it, Adam. Our new beginning." I nodded, but even as I smiled back at her, a faint unease began to creep into my thoughts. Leaving had been the easy part. Now we had to figure out how to build a life from nothing. The days that followed were a blur of long walks, cheap roadside meals, and whispered plans. We didn't talk much about the life we'd left behind, focusing instead on the one we were trying to create. But then, one evening, as we rested in a small inn on the outskirts of a bustling city, Eliza found something that changed everything. It was an old photograph, tucked into the back of a drawer in the room we had rented. She held it up, her brow furrowing as she studied it. "Adam," she said, her voice tinged with curiosity. "Come look at this." I walked over to her, taking the photograph from her hands. It was a black and white image, slightly faded with age. A group of people stood together at what looked like a formal gathering, their smiles frozen in time. My eyes scanned the faces, and then I froze. There, in the center of the group, were two people I recognized immediately. My mother and a man I had never met but had seen in countless photos, Eliza's father. "What the hell?" I muttered, my heart pounding as I stared at the image. Eliza looked at me, her expression mirroring my confusion. "Do you think they knew each other?" she asked. "I don't know," I said, shaking my head. Eliza said finally, her voice steady despite the storm of emotions I could see brewing in her eyes. I nodded, but deep down, I knew that whatever answers we found might shatter the fragile world we had just begun to build. The photograph haunted me for days. No matter how I tried to rationalize it, questions kept gnawing at the edges of my mind. How could my mother have known Eliza's father? Why had they never mentioned it? And why did I feel this sinking sense of dread? Like unearthing the truth would come at a cost I wasn't ready to pay? Eliza and I debated what to do as we made our way deeper into the city. "We need to confront them, Adam," she said one evening, her voice low but resolute. "Confront them how, Eliza? Call them up and demand answers," I asked, frustration bubbling to the surface. "They won't tell us anything. Your father would sooner slam the phone in my face than admit to knowing my mom." She leaned back in her chair, staring out the window of the tiny diner we had stopped at for dinner. The city outside was alive with noise. Cars honking, people shouting, life moving at a pace that felt foreign compared to our sleepy little town. "There has to be a way," she said softly, more to herself than to me. That night, we agreed to keep the photograph and wait until the right moment to ask questions. Until then, we tried to lose ourselves in the day-to-day chaos of surviving in a new place. We found a modest room to rent above a bookstore, its floors creaky but clean, and the landlady, an elderly woman named Mrs. Pollard, took pity on us. "Young love," she mused, handing us the keys. "You two remind me of myself and my late husband. The world didn't approve of us either, but we made it work." Eliza beamed at her, and for a moment, the weight of our discoveries seemed to lift. But as the days turned into weeks, I couldn't shake the unease that lingered. It was a Sunday morning when the dam finally broke. I woke up to find Eliza sitting cross-legged on the bed, the photograph clutched in her hands. "I've been thinking," she said, her voice unusually calm. "Maybe we don't need to call them. Maybe there's another way to get answers." I rubbed the sleep from my eyes and sat up. "What do you mean?" She held up the photograph. "Look at the back." I hadn't thought to check before, but now I noticed faint writing in blue ink along the bottom corner. It was faded, but still legible. "Harvest Ball, October 1998. I blinked. "That's over 20 years ago." "Exactly," Eliza said, her eyes bright with determination. "This wasn't just some casual encounter. It was a formal event, something big enough that they took a picture together. There has to be a record of it somewhere, newspapers, guest lists, something." Her plan was simple but ambitious. Dig into the past and piece together the story ourselves. Felt daunting, but it also felt right. We couldn't go to our parents without proof, not when the stakes were this high. The local library became our headquarters. Rows of dusty archives and old microfilm reels provided a treasure trove of information, but sifting through decades of history was no easy task. Hours turned into days, and just when I started to think we'd never find anything, Eliza let out a triumphant gasp. "Adam, look at this." I rushed over to where she sat, her finger pointing to a grainy black and white photo in an old newspaper. It was an article about the Harvest Ball from October 1998. The photo wasn't the same as the one we had, but it featured some of the same people, including my mother and Eliza's father. Local elites gather for annual charity gala. I read aloud, scanning the text beneath the photo. My heart stopped when I saw their names listed in the caption. Sophia Reynolds and Richard Hayes among attendees. I stared at the names, my pulse pounding in my ears. Sophia Reynolds, my mother. Richard Hayes, Eliza's father. They were there together, Eliza said, her voice trembling. But why? And why didn't they ever tell us? We read the article carefully, but it offered little insight beyond confirming that they had attended the event. Frustrated but unwilling to give up, we decided to keep digging. As the days went on, we began to uncover fragments of a story we hadn't expected. Old articles mentioned Richard Hayes as a prominent businessman known for his charm and ambition. Sophia Reynolds appeared frequently in society pages, often described as enigmatic and unpredictable. But it was a small piece buried in the back of an old gossip column that sent chills down my spine. Rumors swirl around Harvest Ball attendees Sophia Reynolds and Richard Hayes. Sources suggest the two were seen leaving together late in the evening. Could romance be in the air? Or is it just another fleeting affair? An affair, I muttered, my hands gripping the edge of the table. Eliza's face was pale as she read over my shoulder. Do you think? I shook my head, trying to make sense of it. My mother had never mentioned Richard Hayes, let alone anything about an affair. But the pieces were starting to fit together, and the picture they painted was unsettling. Maybe it was nothing, Eliza said, though her voice lacked conviction. Just a rumor, like they said. Or maybe it wasn't, I replied, the weight of the possibility pressing down on me. The more we uncovered, the more questions arose. Why had our parents kept their connection a secret? And if there had been an affair, what had come of it? One evening, as we sat in our room surrounded by stacks of old newspapers, Eliza spoke up. Adam, there's something else we need to consider. What's that? She hesitated, her fingers tracing the edges of the photograph. What if there's more to this than just an affair? What if it's the reason they've been so against us being together? The thought hit me like a punch to the gut. I had always assumed their disapproval was about status, personality, or some other petty reason. But what if it was something far more significant? Do you think they know something we don't? I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Eliza nodded. I think it's time we asked them. I stared at her, torn between fear and the need for answers. You really think they'll tell us the truth? She met my gaze, her eyes filled with a quiet determination. If they don't, we'll find it ourselves. The idea of confronting our parents filled me with a dread I couldn't shake. What if Eliza was right? What if their disapproval of our relationship ran deeper than we ever imagined? The thought lingered like a storm cloud, but we both knew we couldn't avoid it forever. Eliza suggested we start with my mother. She had always been the more level-headed of the two, and I thought she might be easier to approach. I called her the next morning, my fingers trembling as I dialed her number. Adam, she answered, her voice sharp and brisk, just like always. Is everything all right? I hesitated, glancing at Eliza, who was sitting across from me, silently urging me on. Yeah, Mom. I have some questions. About the past. There was a long pause on the other end of the line. What kind of questions? It's about you and Richard Hayes, I said, my voice firmer than I expected. Silence. The kind of silence that feels heavier than words. Why are you asking about him? She said finally, her tone guarded. Because I found a photograph, I replied, gripping the phone tightly. A photo of you and him at the Harvest Ball in 1998. Why didn't you ever tell me you knew him? Adam, she sighed, and I could hear the tension in her voice. That's ancient history. It's not something you need to concern yourself with. That's not good enough, I snapped, surprising even myself. I'm with Eliza now, and we need to know the truth. Why didn't you tell me about him? What happened between you two? Another pause. Then, in a voice barely above a whisper, she said, "It's complicated." "Uncomplicated for me," I demanded. There was a sound on the other end, like she was shifting in her seat or pacing. Finally, she spoke. "Richard and we were close once. Very close. But it didn't work out. He was married and I wasn't willing to be his secret." Her words hit me like a punch to the stomach. I glanced at Eliza, who was leaning forward, hanging on to every word. "Is that all?" I asked, though I could feel there was more she wasn't saying. "It should be," she replied, her voice tight. "But things got complicated." "What do you mean, complicated?" She sighed again, and for a moment, I thought she wouldn't answer. But then she said, "Richard and I had a child." "Asson." The world seemed to tilt beneath me. I felt like the air had been sucked out of the room. "Asson?" I repeated, my voice cracking. "Yes," she said, her tone heavy with regret. "But I never told him. I left town before he ever found out. It was better that way. He had his life and I had mine." My heart pounded in my chest as I processed her words. "You mean to tell me that I might have a half-brother?" "No," she said quickly. "Adam, you're the child. You're the son I had with Richard Hayes." The phone slipped from my hand, clattering onto the table. Eliza's eyes widened in shock, and she rushed over to me, picking up the phone and speaking into it. "Mrs. Reynolds, is this true?" "Yes," my mother replied, her voice trembling. "I didn't want you to find out like this. I wanted to protect you." Eliza ended the call, her hands shaking as she placed the phone back on the table. For a moment, we just stared at each other, neither of us knowing what to say. "So, we're siblings?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. I shook my head, unable to accept it. "No. There has to be some kind of mistake. There's no way." But the pieces were falling into place, and deep down, I knew it was true. Our parents had kept this secret buried for decades, and now it was unraveling right in front of us. Eliza stood up abruptly, pacing the room. "I need to talk to my father," she said, her voice filled with determination. "He has to know something about this." "Wait," I said, grabbing her arm. "Are you sure that's a good idea? What if he denies it? Or worse, what if he confirms it?" She looked at me, her eyes filled with tears. "I have to know, Adam. We both do." Reluctantly, I agreed. The next day, Eliza called her father, arranging to meet him at his office. I went with her, though the thought of facing Richard Hayes made my stomach churn. When we arrived, he greeted us with his usual stern demeanor, his eyes narrowing slightly when he saw me. "What's this about?" he asked, gesturing for us to sit. Eliza didn't waste any time. She pulled out the photograph and placed it on his desk. "We found this," she said, "and we know about you and Sophia Reynolds." His expression hardened, and for a moment, I thought he might throw us out. But then he leaned back in his chair, his gaze shifting between Eliza and me. "What exactly do you think you know?" he asked, his voice cold. "We know you had an affair," Eliza said, her voice steady despite the tension in the room. "And we know about the child." His jaw tightened, and I saw a flicker of something in his eyes. Guilt, maybe, or regret. "I don't know what you think you've uncovered," he said, "but you're digging into things that are better left buried." "Don't lie to us," I said, my anger boiling over. "I deserve to know the truth. Did you know about me? Did you know I was your son?" He froze, his face pale. For a long moment he said nothing. Then, in a voice that was barely audible, he said, "No, I didn't know. Not until now." Eliza gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. I felt like the ground had been ripped out from under me. "Why?" I demanded. "Why didn't you try to find out? Why didn't you care?" He looked at me, and for the first time, I saw something resembling vulnerability in his eyes. "Because I was a coward," he admitted. "I had a family, a reputation to protect. I thought I could leave it all behind and move on. But I was wrong." The room fell silent, the weight of his confession hanging heavy in the air. "So what now?" Eliza asked, her voice trembling. "What are we supposed to do with this?" He didn't answer, and I realized he didn't have one. None of us did. Eliza and I left her father's office in a haze of shock and disbelief. The revelations had stripped away any sense of normalcy we once had, leaving us raw and exposed to a truth we didn't want to accept. We walked in silence for a long time, the weight of what we'd learned hanging between us like an unbearable burden. Finally, Eliza spoke. "What are we supposed to do now, Adam?" Her voice cracked, and I could hear the tears she was holding back. I stopped walking and turned to her. "I don't know," I admitted, my own voice shaky. "I don't know how to process this, let alone figure out what comes next." She sank onto a bench by the sidewalk, burying her face in her hands. "This isn't fair," she whispered. "We didn't ask for this. We didn't ask to be connected like this." I sat down beside her, feeling just as lost. "No, we didn't. But here we are." She looked up at me, her eyes red and swollen. Do you think we can come back from this? You and me?" Her question cut deep because it was the same one I'd been asking myself. Could we move forward knowing what we now knew? Could we untangle ourselves from the web of lies and betrayal that our parents had spun? "I don't know," I said honestly. "But I do know one thing, we deserve the whole truth. No more half answers. No more secrets. If we're going to figure out where we stand, we need to know everything." Eliza nodded, wiping her eyes. "You're right. We need to talk to them, both of them, together." The thought of sitting down with my mother and her father, confronting them side by side, filled me with dread. But Eliza was right. It was the only way forward. The following evening, we arranged for them to meet us at the small cafe where Eliza and I had spent so many late nights planning our future. Felt surreal sitting there and waiting for them, knowing that this conversation could change everything. When they arrived, the tension was palpable. My mother looked hesitant, her eyes flicking nervously to Richard, who seemed equally uneasy. "What is this about?" my mother asked, though I could tell she already knew. "It's about the truth," I said, my voice steady despite the turmoil inside me. "It's about everything you've been hiding from us." Richard sighed, running a hand through his graying hair. "We've already told you what you need to know." "No," Eliza said firmly, her gaze piercing. "You've told us pieces, but not the whole story. And we deserve the whole story." My mother glanced at Richard, then back at me. "Adam? I didn't want you to find out like this. I thought I was protecting you." "Protecting me from what?" I demanded. "From the fact that the man I've been in love with might be my sister? From the lies you've both been living for decades?" "Don't you dare blame this on me," Richard interjected, his voice sharp. "Sophia, you were the one who walked away. You were the one who chose to keep him from me. And you were the one who lied to your wife, to your daughter," she shot back. "Don't act like you're some kind of victim here." "Enough!" Eliza's voice rang out, silencing them both. "This isn't about your past mistakes. This is about us, Adam and me. We're the ones paying the price for your choices, and we need answers." Richard looked at her, his expression softening. "What do you want to know?" "Everything," I said. "Start from the beginning. No more lies." They exchanged a glance, and for a moment I thought they might refuse. But then my mother took a deep breath and began to speak. "Richard and I met at a business gala in 1997, she said, her voice quiet but steady. "I was young, ambitious, and eager to make connections. He was charming and persistent." Richard gave a bitter laugh. "You make it sound so innocent." She ignored him and continued. "We started seeing each other in secret. First it was just fun, but then it became something more. I fell for him even though I knew it was wrong. He was married and I was naive." Richard sighed. "I wasn't exactly an innocent party either. I knew what I was doing and I knew the risks, but I couldn't stay away from her. When I found out I was pregnant," my mother said, her voice trembling, "I knew I couldn't keep living that life. I didn't want to raise a child in the middle of an affair." So I left. I moved away, started over, and told no one about you, Adam. Not even him. I looked at Richard, my anger bubbling to the surface. And you never suspected? You never tried to find out? He shook his head. I thought she left because she was done with me. I didn't know there was more to it. Not until now. Eliza's voice broke through the tension. But that's not the whole story, is it? There's more you're not telling us. My mother hesitated, her eyes flicking to Richard. There is, she admitted. But it's not something I'm proud of. Tell us, I said, my voice firm. She looked down at her hands, as if gathering the courage to continue. Your father, Adam, your real father, he wasn't just Richard. There was someone else. Someone who found out about the affair and tried to use it against us. What do you mean? I asked, my heart pounding. He was Richard's business rival, she said. He threatened to expose everything unless we paid him off. Richard handled it. Richard's face darkened, his jaw tightening. I did what I had to do to protect my family, to protect all of us. I felt like the ground was slipping out from under me. What are you saying? Richard met my gaze, his expression grim. I'm saying that man, your father, didn't just disappear. I made sure he couldn't come after us again. The room fell silent, the weight of his words sinking in. You killed him, I whispered, horrified. Richard didn't answer, but the look in his eyes was enough. Eliza stood up abruptly, her chair scraping against the floor. I can't do this, she said, her voice trembling. I can't sit here and listen to this anymore. She turned and walked out of the cafe, leaving me torn between following her and confronting the parents who had destroyed everything we thought we knew. I stayed frozen in my seat, my mind racing. The truth had finally come to light, but it wasn't the closure I had hoped for. It was a nightmare. I found Eliza sitting on the steps of the cafe, her arms wrapped around herself as if she was trying to hold her entire world together. The evening breeze tugged at her hair, and the soft glow of the streetlights cast shadows across her face. Eliza, I said gently, sitting down beside her. She didn't look at me. I can't believe this is our life now, she whispered. I know, I said, my voice heavy, but we'll figure it out, somehow. She finally turned to me, her eyes filled with anguish. How, Adam? How do we come back from this? We've been lied to our entire lives. Everything we thought we knew, it's all a lie. And us, we can't be together. Not like this. Her words hit me like a physical blow, but I couldn't argue with her. The truth had created a chasm between us that seemed impossible to cross. Eliza, I said softly, reaching for her hand. I don't know what the future holds for us, but I do know that what we've shared, it was real. It wasn't a lie. They lied to us, yes, but what we had was true. Don't let them take that away from us too. She looked down at our hands, her fingers trembling in mine. I don't even know who I am anymore, she admitted. Everything feels tainted. You, me, even my family. How do I even face my father after this? I hesitated, choosing my words carefully. We're not responsible for their mistakes, Eliza. We're not to blame for their choices. But we can't let those choices define us either. We have to decide who we want to be, no matter how messy it gets. She nodded slowly, though I could see the uncertainty still etched across her face. I need time, she said finally. Time to figure out what any of this means. I'll give you all the time you need, I said, meaning every word. We sat there in silence for a while, the noise of the city fading into the background. Despite everything, I couldn't bring myself to let go of her hand. The days that followed were a blur of unanswered questions and restless nights. Eliza and I decided to take a step back from each other, giving ourselves space to process everything. It was agonizing, but we both knew it was necessary. I couldn't stop thinking about what Richard had said, that he had handled my father. The idea that my existence was born out of lies, betrayal, and possibly even violence haunted me. I needed closure, and there was only one way to get it. One evening, I went to my mother's house, determined to get the truth from her. She said softly, stepping aside to let me in. I walked into the living room, memories of my childhood swirling around me. It all felt so distant now, like someone else's life. "I need to know everything," I said, turning to face her. "No more evasions, no more half-truths. Tell me what happened to my father." She hesitated, wringing her hands. "Adam, I've already told you." "No," I interrupted, my voice firm. "You told me pieces of the story. Now I need the whole thing." She sank onto the couch, looking more fragile than I'd ever seen her. "Your father, his name was David," she began, her voice trembling. "He and Richard were rivals in business. David was ambitious, brilliant, but he had a temper. When he found out about me and Richard, he was furious. He threatened to expose us, to ruin Richard's career and my reputation." Her eyes filled with tears, and she looked down at her hands. "I begged him to let it go, but he wouldn't. He said he would never stop until Richard paid for what we'd done. That's when Richard stepped in." I swallowed hard, already knowing where this was going. "What did he do?" "He confronted David," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "They argued and things got physical. I wasn't there, but Richard told me later that it was an accident. He didn't mean for it to happen." I felt a wave of nausea wash over me. "Didn't mean for what to happen?" She looked up at me, tears streaming down her face. "David fell. Richard said it was an accident, that he hit his head and didn't get up." I stared at her, my mind racing. "And you just covered it up?" "I didn't know what else to do," she said, her voice breaking. "We were terrified. If anyone found out, Richard would have gone to prison, and I didn't want you to grow up without a father." I stood there, frozen, as the weight of her words sank in. My real father was dead, his life taken in a moment of violence and desperation, and his memory buried beneath a web of lies. "I can't believe this," I said finally, my voice shaking. "You let me grow up thinking I had a normal life, all while carrying this secret." "I did it for you," she said, her tone pleading. "I know it doesn't make it right, but I was trying to protect you." I shook my head, unable to look at her. "You weren't protecting me. You were protecting yourself." In the weeks that followed, I tried to make sense of everything. Eliza and I kept our distance, but the ache of missing her never went away. I thought about reaching out to her, but I didn't know what to say. One day she called me. Her voice was steady, but I could tell she'd been crying. "Can we meet?" she asked. We met at the park where we'd first kissed, a bittersweet reminder of how much had changed. She looked beautiful, but there was a sadness in her eyes that mirrored my own. "I've been thinking a lot," she said, sitting down beside me on the bench. "About us, about everything." "Me too," I said quietly. She turned to me, her expression serious. "I love you, Adam. I don't know what that means for us now, or if we can ever really be together. But I do know that I don't regret loving you." Her words brought tears to my eyes. "I love you too, Eliza, and I don't regret it either, no matter how complicated it gets." We sat there in silence, the weight of everything still heavy on our shoulders. But for the first time in weeks, there was a glimmer of hope, fragile, uncertain, but real. Our story wasn't over. It would never be easy, but we had survived the worst of it. And maybe, just maybe, we could find a way forward. Together.